Chapter 8. The air reeked of scorched iron and the seared flesh of slaves. The caustic night fog of Hag Grafe swirled and eddied in the roads and alleys, a thick greenish-yellow pall that oozed down into the valley from the chimney vents of the forges on the mountain slopes above. Silver steel, the precious semi-magical metal prized by the Druki, was difficult and expensive to make, and thousands of slaves died every year around the great crucibles, their throats and lungs ravaged by the poisonous fumes. Malus wore a night mask of black iron, worked in the shape of a snarling Noglier, his cloak pulled close around his head to keep the fog from his neck and scalp. His cold one, Spite, loped along the spear road at a steady ground-eating pace. Occasionally he would toss his head and snap at the stinging clouds of mist that attacked his nostrils and eyes. They had slipped from the Drakau's fortress without incident, swinging into the saddles and setting off as soon as they reached the stables. Malus knew the Drakau would take no personal interest in a family feud. The Highborn were encouraged to fight amongst themselves, ensuring the strongest and smartest survived to fight for the Witch King. Yet it was possible that Uriel had enough influence at court to order the gates of the city closed against him. Trapped within the city, he could much more easily be located and retaliated against. Uriel could conceivably turn him over to the Temple of Cain, ensuring an agonizing death for his half-brother, and gaining increased favour from the priestesses besides. Speed was of the essence. Right now, Malus imagined Uriel restoring order and having the entire tower searched, while he rushed to his sanctum to ensure that his most precious relics were safe. When he realized the skull was missing, Uriel would spare no effort to keep the thieves from escaping. How long, Malus wondered. How long until his brother realized what had happened? How quickly will he react? The city's north gate, also known as the Spear Gate, was just ahead. Normally reserved solely for military traffic heading north to the watchtowers near the Chaos Wastes. It was the closest way out of the city. Malus turned in his saddle to look back along his small column of riders. The Druki who'd been stung by one of Uriel's guard beasts, a man named Atalvir, was getting steadily worse as the creature's poison ravaged his body. They'd stuck a cloth in the wound and lashed Atalvir to his saddle. He hoped the guard captain at the gate wouldn't inspect the warriors too closely and wonder why they were leaving for the frontier with a wounded man in the column. Snow was still falling from the leaden sky, turning to mist as it descended through the curtains of warm night fog. The city wall gained definition as they approached, resolving itself from a looming dark grey band into a smooth black barrier some 30 feet high and crowned with spike merlons all along its length. The north gatehouse was well lit with witchfire globes, gleaming like the eyes of a huge patient predator. The maw-like opening of the great gate was shut against the darkness outside. Malus was nearly beneath the gatehouse's massive overhang when a muffled voice from above cried, "Halt! Who goes there?" The Highborn reined in Spite, raising a hand to halt the column.
"I am Malus, son of Lurhan the Volcar!"
Malus shouted at the invisible sentry. For a moment, there was no reply. Then,
"The gate is closed for the night, Dreadlord. What is your business?"
Malus gritted his teeth in aggravation.
"My father has ordered me to lead a party of men north to the Tower of Grond, and to go with all haste."
This time, the silence stretched uncomfortably long.
"They're trying to make heads or tails of the situation,"
Malus thought. On the one hand, it meant they have no specific orders concerning him. On the other hand, the longer they dithered, the greater the chance that such orders could arrive. He straightened in his saddle.
"Will you make me wait here until dawn? Open the gate, damn you!"
The echoes of his shout were still reverberating from the walls when there was a rattle of metal at one of the gatehouse's doors, and a guard captain in full armour stepped into view. Spite hissed menacingly and took a half step towards the man before Malus jerked the Noglier's head aside with a pull of the reins.
Stand!
Malus ordered, and the cold one settled onto its haunches. The highborn slid smoothly from the saddle, throwing a glance over his shoulder to Lenara, who was second in the column. Her expression was inscrutable behind her night mask, but her hands hovered close to the crossbow hooked to her saddle. Malus walked over to the guard captain, pulling aside his iron mask so that his impatience was clearly evident.
I've had men skinned alive for making me wait this long,
he said with an air of casual malevolence. The guard captain was no callow recruit, however. His pale, scarred face regarded Malus impassively.
We don't open the gate after nightfall, Dreadlord. Orders from your father, the Volcar. It's been that way since the start of the feud with Nagar.
The highborn's eyes narrowed appraisingly.
You could have told me that from behind a firing slit, he thought. What are you really after, Captain? I'm certain Lurhan is well aware of the standing orders, Captain. I'd also say that if anyone can make exceptions to those orders, it would be him. Is there anything I can offer you as proof?
The captain inclined his head thoughtfully, studying the gatehouse overhang. They were both outside the line of sight of the guards above.
Well,
he said, running his tongue along carefully filed front teeth. If you could show me some written orders, Dreadlord, or some proof of authority.
Malus smiled mirthlessly. Oh, of course. I ought to ram my dagger through your eye, he thought brutally, but that wouldn't get the gate open.
Just then, a high-pitched, querulous piping floated through the snowy air overhead. Malus looked up in time to see a long, almost snake-like shape furl broad, leathery wings and arrow through one of the gatehouse's narrow windows. He caught a glimpse of long, indigo-coloured jesses dangling from the reptile's taloned feet. The guard captain frowned.
That's a message from the hag. Perhaps that's word from your father there, Dreadlord. My father? No,
the highborn thought. Malus reached into a pouch at his belt.
Here is proof of my authority, Captain.
He pressed a ruby the size of a bird's egg into the man's palm. It was one of the last pieces of treasure left from his summer raid. The guard captain held the gem up to his eye, and his face went slack with wonder.
That'll do,
he breathed, tucking it into his coin purse.
Of course, you'll need proof of authority to get back into the city upon your return as well.
The highborn laughed at the sheer audacity of the man. On one hand, he had to admire such implacable avarice. On the other hand, extorting money from above one's station demanded a brutal reprisal.
Don't worry, Captain. I've an excellent memory. When I return to the hag, I'll make certain you're amply attended to. You have my oath on it.
The guard captain smiled.
Excellent. I'm always at your service, Dreadlord. If you'd kindly mount up, I'll have the gate open in a moment.
The Druki spun smartly on his heel and stepped back inside the gatehouse, closing the iron-bound door behind him. Malus fought the urge not to run back to Spite.
One man is ordering the gate opened, he thought. Another is reading the letter from Uriel and deciding what to do. Which one will trump the other? Make ready!
Malus hissed to the column as he swung into the saddle. From within the gatehouse came a rattle of enormous chains. Slowly, the enormous iron gates began to pull back, revealing the tunnel leading to the outer portal. At once, Malus kicked Spite into motion, waving the column to follow.
We could get trapped inside, he thought, gritting his teeth. They could shut the inner gate, trap us between the two portals, and rain fire down on us if they wish.
He made a snap decision. If he couldn't see the outer gate starting to move, he'd wheel the column about and race into the city.
We'll climb the wall at another point if we have to, he raged inwardly. I will not be caged here like a rabbit.
Spite's leathery feet slapped along the cobblestones. eager perhaps for the open country and relief from the biting fog. The gate swung ponderously on its ancient hinges. It was just wide enough to allow an Auglier to pass. Malus spurred his mount forward, his eyes straining to pierce the gloom beyond. Was that a shaft of grey light? Yes! Malus cried, jabbing sharply with his spurs. Spite lurched into a run. The sounds of heavy footfalls reverberated through the narrow passage beneath the gatehouse, an echoing rumble like sullen thunder. Malus could see a bar of wan moonlight just ahead, and bared his teeth triumphantly.
Too late, brother,
the highborn thought. Spite leapt through the yawning gate with a rumbling growl, his clawed feet slipping on the snow-covered road. There was a shout from above, and a sharp thump as a bolt as long as Spite's tail punched into the frozen ground a handspan to their left. There was a whickering sound, and another shaft blurred past the cold one's scaly snout, causing the Auglier to snap its jaws and shy to the side. The Druki in the tower had evidently reached a compromise. Let the riders out onto the killing field before the gate, and present a pile of corpses to Uriel when he arrived. Corpses thoroughly picked clean of valuables, of course.
Faster!
Malus cried, applying the spurs. Another bolt went wide, ricocheting off the hard surface of the road and skimming its icy surface like a steel-headed viper. The highborn stole a look over his shoulder. Most of the warband was already clear. Two of the riders were looking back over their shoulders as well, aiming their crossbows one-handed and firing bolts at the narrow embrasures, mostly for spite's sake. Already the walls of the city were losing focus, their edges going grey behind gusts of snow as the highborn sped farther down the spear road. There was another thump from the gatehouse, and Malus watched the black diamond shape of a heavy bolt swell in his vision. But the gunner on the wall had misjudged the range, and the bolt fell short, striking a rider a yard behind the highborn. The armor-piercing point punched through the rider's breastplate with a loud crack and plunged on into the back of his Auglier's thick skull. Rider and mount tumbled end for end, kicking up a spray of blood-tinged snow, then fetched up in a broken heap in the middle of the road. Malus steeled himself for another shot, but when he glanced warily back at the gatehouse, he saw that Hag Grafe was just a ghostly smudge, grey against the winter night. Malus gave a wild, vicious laugh, hoping the guards at the gatehouse could hear him.
That was your best chance to catch me, brother, he thought. Now every league will carry me further from your grasp. Soon there will be nothing more for you to do than wait in your twisted spire and dread my return. Run, Spite! Tireless beast of the deep earth! Carry me north, where the tools of my vengeance awaits!
They'd covered half a dozen leagues in the darkness and the snow before Atalvir toppled from his saddle. The first indication Malus had of a problem was a change in the sound of the loping Auglier. The steady run of a dozen cold ones was not quiet. Even on the snowy road they moved with a low rumble of heavy-footed thunder. Suddenly the rumble slackened. Looking back, Malus could not at first discern why the column had stopped. He reined Spite around and headed back down the road, until he found Alvar and the rest of Nagaira's men clustered around their fallen comrade. Atalvir's Cold One had wandered off the road and rested on its haunches in a snowy field nearby. Lunara had kept the rest of the warband mounted, eyes scanning the road and the surrounding countryside. Malus slid from the saddle, seething with impatience. The snow had slackened as they'd moved north, and he was counting on it to cover their tracks as much as possible.
"What's this?"
he said to Dalvar. Dalvar looked up from Atalvir's writhing form. "That damned poison. He has some kind of spasm, and snapped his lashings. Then fell from the saddle. I thought the venom would have run its course by now, but it's getting worse." The wind shifted, and the Highborn's nose wrinkled.
"He's putrefying," Malus snapped. "The venom is eating him from within. Cut his throat and have done! We've many more miles to go before dawn."
Nagaira's men studied Malus coldly. Dalvar slowly shook his head. "I have some potions in my saddlebag. Let me see if I can slow the poison's work. Get him back in the saddle."
"And what then? Ride another few leagues before he collapses again? Speed is our only ally now. We must make it past the watchtowers before Uriel can organize a pursuit."
Dalvar stood, folding his arms. "Would you squander a fighting man for a few minutes riding time? We'll need every sword we can muster in the wastes. Surely you know that." Malus ground his teeth, fighting the urge to strike the man's head from his shoulders. A move against Dalvar would bring out the knives from every quarter. When the dust settled, his warband would be cut in half, no matter the outcome.
10 minutes,
he said, then headed back to Spite. He heard the leathery tread of a Noglier sidling up behind him. Malus looked back to see Lenara and Van Heer pacing him back along the road. "He's going to be a problem," Lenara murmured, the wind whipping long strands of dark hair about her pale face.
"They're all a problem,"
Malus replied.
"I trusted Nagaira to keep her thugs in line once we'd left the Hag. Her greed for the power hidden in the temple would have ensured her cooperation, at least to a point. Dalvar is another matter. If we move against him, no matter how subtly, the rest will turn on us, and I expect he's right. We'll need every sword we can muster where we're going."
"Has my lord ever hunted in the wastes?" Van Heer's tone was utterly cold, his formerly melodious voice now flat and portentous as a dirge. Malus glared over his shoulder at the highborn knight, but the warrior was watching the forest opposite their side of the road. Van Heer had suffered every night on the week-long march from Clarkarond to the Hag. He'd lost enough skin to make Malus a fine pair of boots, all told. Since then, the knight's hatred had crystallized into a cold hardness that Malus couldn't quite fathom. It was as if Van Heer had reached a decision about something, and was only just biding his time. Was the knight ready to cast aside his famous honour for the sweet wine of treachery?
"I have not," Malus said evenly. "I took a turn with the garrison at Grond, during my father's misguided attempts to get me killed in some border raid. But no, I have never travelled into the wastes. Have you?"
Van Heer turned to regard his erstwhile master. His dark eyes were like polished basalt. "Oh yes, Dreadlord. The best hunting can be found there. Just a week's ride or so from the frontier. My family made its wealth ambushing nomadic raiders along the steppes." He straightened in the saddle and shot Malus a challenging look. "It's not a place for the brash or the foolish, or warriors of poor metal." Before Malus knew it, his sword was naked in his hand, and he'd crossed half the distance to Van Heer, when Lenara let out a sharp hiss. "Horses' hooves! Someone's riding fast upon the road from the Hag!" Malus restrained himself with an effort of will. He cocked his head, straining to hear over the restless wind, but heard nothing. But the highborn knew better than to doubt Lenara's keen senses. He leapt into the saddle, blade still in hand.
"Off the road! Quickly!"
The three Druki spurred their mounts back to the rest of the warband. Malus quickly sized up the terrain. They were in the foothills north and west of the Dragonspines, a place of dense woods and treacherous marshes. Off the road to the left were stagnant pools and stands of tall thorn grass, leading back to the dense woods and underbrush on the other side of a shallow pond.
"That way!"
He pointed with his sword.
Into the tree line, across the pond!
Dalvar was kneeling by the fallen warrior, whose convulsions had eased, but who still seemed incapable of moving. What about him?
Put his sword in his hand and leave him, or stay behind and die at his side.
For a moment, Dalvar looked ready to protest, but the sound of distant hoofbeats galvanized him into action. He drew the man's sword and pressed it into the Druki's palm, then scrambled into the saddle and joined the warband as they dashed across the fen. The Cold Ones handled the terrain with ease, something a horse would have been hard-pressed to emulate. They nosed into the thick undergrowth, panicking small animals in their path and brushing aside thickets of brambles, without slowing their stride. Once out of sight, the Druki dismounted, and Malus led them back to the edge of the trees.
Crossbows ready,
he ordered, as they settled down behind fallen logs and thick underbrush.
No one fires unless I give the word.
Malus took cover behind a broad oak tree. Dalvar settled into a crouch beside him.
Another minute, and he'd have been ready to move,
the retainer growled.
Then it's fortunate for us that our pursuit came early, and Adalvir could still serve us as bait.
Before Dalvar could reply, a group of riders swept into view, riding tall black war horses. They wore heavy black cloaks with full hoods, and held long, ebon-shafted spears in their hands. One of the riders surveyed the area surrounding the fallen Druki, and Malus saw moonlight glint on a silver steel night mask.
Uriel's men all right,
Malus noted.
They must have left right on our heels to have caught up with us so quickly.
He counted only 5 riders, however, which surprised him. Possibly an advance force, hurriedly dispatched ahead of a larger hunting party. He and his men would make short work of these riders, and hide the bodies in the fen. Until he noticed that something wasn't quite right about the men and their mounts. Steam curled from the horses' muscular flanks, and they pranced and pawed at the earth as though fresh from the stables, not at the end of leagues of hard riding. And there was something strange about the riders themselves. The way their masked faces turned first one way and then another, like hounds searching for a scent. Suddenly the air shook with a deep-throated roar as Adalvir's Cold One rose from its haunches and crept up onto the road. The slow-witted beast had finally caught the horse's scent. Noglier loved the taste of horse flesh. Malus's concern deepened when none of the horses panicked at the Noglier's hunting roar. The riders reined their mounts around to face the approaching Cold One, moving as though driven by a single mind. Malus felt the cold touch of dread run a talon down his spine. The Cold One leapt, and the riders spurred their mounts to meet it. At the last minute, they split to either side of the beast. But one horse was not as fast as its mates, and the Noglier knocked it to the ground with its powerful shoulder, then locked its jaws around the animal's neck. The horse screamed, not a cry of fear of pain, however, but of rage. The rider rolled easily out of the saddle and sprang to his feet, readying his spear. The other riders struck at both of the Cold One's flanks, driving their spears deep into the beast's side. The Noglier roared and lashed its tails, catching one rider full in the chest. There was a splintering sound, and the rider flew backwards out of the saddle, landing in a misshapen heap almost 15 feet away.
That's one,
Dalvar hissed triumphantly.
No,
Malus said.
Look!
The broken, twisted shape was still moving. As they watched, the man pushed himself to his knees, then climbed to his feet. One arm hung limp, and the man's ribcage was clearly smashed. Yet he stood and drew his sword and rejoined the fight. Even the horse the Cold One had bitten had scrambled back up and bolted away from the creature, blood pouring from its neck. The Cold One thrashed and spun in a wide circle, trying to attack all its tormentors at once. Its flanks bristled with long spears, and a huge pool of crimson melted the snow beneath its scaly body. The first dismounted rider was edging closer, his spear levelled at the Noglir's right eye, waiting for the right moment to strike. Sensing his opportunity, he leapt forward, right into the creature's gaping jaws. The beast had not been as oblivious to the man's approach as it had appeared. It moved like a striking snake, taking man, spear, and all into its fanged mouth, up to the rider's waist. It bit down with a shattering crunch, spraying blood in a wide fan, and shook the man in its teeth like some great terrier with a rat. The other riders paused, seemingly considering their next move. Then suddenly, the Cold One let out a strangled cry. It shook its head fiercely once more, then swayed to its feet. Suddenly, Malus saw the creature's skin start to bulge slightly, just behind the eyes, and then with a sharp cracking sound, a silver steel spearhead punched through the Noglir's skull from the inside out. Blood and brain matter stained the sharp point. The beast gave a shudder, then collapsed.
"Blessed Mother of Night," Dalvar said, his voice drained. "What are those things?" "They are murder given form," Malus said, struggling to believe what he'd seen with his own eyes. "Uriel must be very, very angry. Or possibly afraid," he thought with a start. "If so, the treasure that awaits must be very great indeed."
While they watched, the remaining 3 riders dismounted and drew their swords. One began cutting into the Noglir's side, while the others started hacking the beast's skull apart to free their companion. Within a few moments' time, the spearman staggered free, his entrails spilling from his ravaged belly and catching on the beast's jagged teeth. The third swordsman pulled the Noglir's steaming heart from its chest and held it up to the sky. The other 4 lurched over to him, pressed the great organ to their bodies, sluicing gouts of sticky blood across their chests. The 2 wounded riders seemed to gain strength from the enemy's lifeblood. Their wounds did not heal, but neither were they any longer a hindrance. Suddenly moonlight glinted on a spinning blur of metal, and a dagger sprouted from the throat of one of the riders. Atalvir let out a fevered howl of challenge, holding his sword before him as he swayed on unsteady feet. The riders turned to face the warrior, as if noticing him for the first time. The stricken rider reached up and slowly pulled the needle-bladed knife from his throat. As one, they advanced. Malus considered the odds and bit back a curse. "That's it. I've seen enough. We're getting out of here as quickly as we can." "But our crossbows—" "Don't be a fool, Dalvar. It wouldn't make any difference." The Highborn's hand went to the cold lump of metal and stone beneath the lip of his breastplate. "The only reason we're alive right now is because of your mistress's talismans. But I'll wager that if these hounds get much closer, they'll be able to sense the skull no matter what, and then we'll be finished." There was a clash of steel back by the road. Malus turned away. Dalvar watched, his eyes widening. "Where are we going to go?" "Back through these woods for a start, and then up into the hills. These killers are going to be searching the Spear Road for us all the way to the Tower of Grond and possibly beyond. We must find another way across the frontier and into the wastes." Dalvar's eyes widened. "Back into the hills? But they're full of shades." "That's what I'm counting on. If anyone can get us through the mountains unseen, it is they." The retainer's face twisted in fear. "You're mad. The things they do to trespassers." "I would rather try my luck with a foe that dies when I pierce his heart. If we stay here, we die." The Highborn pulled back deeper into the woods. And one by one, the rest of the war band followed. The screams of the man they'd left behind echoed through the snowy trees long after he was lost to sight.